Okay, time for our Fiscal Focus segment, as always sponsored by InfoChoice, your choice of information on Australian consumer finance. Now, being our last Fiscal Focus of the year, we wanted to go out with a bang and focus on what's probably been one of the biggest issues of the year, and that's the ongoing housing crisis, because you clearly can't improve the cost of living without ensuring housing is affordable and accessible for everyone, for which we hold our governments responsible. So today we're talking to Federal Housing Minister Clare O'Neil, who I'm pleased to say joins us now. G'day, Minister. Welcome for joining us on the Savings Tip Jar.
Great to be with you guys. Really appreciate the opportunity.
First question I'll ask is just generally about the home guarantee scheme. Now, I think about a year ago, the government changed it to enable friends to buy together, siblings. Just how has that been? Give us some facts and figures on how successful that uptake's been since that change.
Wonderful. So the home guarantee scheme, just to remind everyone who's listening, is one of the main ways the Commonwealth Government assists home buyers into the market. And since we've been in government for just over 2 years now, 130,000 people have been able to get into the market with the support of the home guarantee scheme. So what the government is basically doing is backing in the buyer and saying to the banks and other lenders, we will support this person and guarantee effectively that they won't default. And that means that you don't have to get lender's mortgage insurance. So for anyone who's bought a home recently, you'll know those lender's mortgage insurance charges are absolutely massive. So sometimes on a $700,000 house, you're paying 30 grand just for lender's mortgage insurance. And so this is the government relieving you of that pressure. So you mentioned we've made some changes, some important ones. We've expanded the number of people that we can assist every year up to 50,000, and we've lifted the income and price caps so that more people can get into the scheme. And we've also allowed a bit more flexibility as to who can be supported. So, for example, friends can now go in together. And we've seen about 1,600 people over the last year do that in friend groups. So that the whole approach of the government is making sure we're helping first home buyers get into the market and giving people flexibility as much as we can about how they use government support.
Now, Minister, you mentioned raising the income caps. Even with the current caps of 125,000 for individuals and I think it's 200,000 for joint applicants, we're still hearing there's a lot of people, particularly in places like Sydney, where you'll have these, young professionals earning what looks like on paper a pretty good income, but they're trying to save money while paying probably close to $1,000 a week in rent and trying to save up a deposit for the typical home, house in Sydney, which you're looking at often over $2 million. So, is there still scope to adjust those income caps further? Because we're hearing a lot of these people, these young professionals in Sydney, are having to resort to high LVR home loan products or even borrowing money just to use as a deposit.
Yeah. Well, first, can I just say, you're exactly right. There's people who are right across the income spectrum who are experiencing really massive pain with housing at the moment. We hear it from, people who are trying to get into the rental market but get refused time after time for applications. Lots of young families who a generation ago or one before that would absolutely have owned their own home, but today in Australia are still stuck in a rent trap. And then the other part of my portfolio that I see this agony is actually a growing share of people who are dropping out of the bottom of the housing market altogether. And we can all see that in the suburbs and communities that we're living in around the country, this rising homelessness. So you talked about the price caps. These things are always being looked at by our government. And so the trade-off that we are always trying to make is making sure that, at the end of the day, taxpayers are paying for support that we give to people for housing. How do we make sure we target that support and build it up for the people who need it most? So I just mentioned that with home ownership, for example, we've got the home guarantee scheme, a really significantly expanded support that we're offering lots of people. We also have a shared equity scheme, which is trying to work its way through the parliament at the moment, where the government effectively is going to come in as the bank of mum and dad and help 40,000 nurses and teachers and aged care workers get into home ownership. And these are the people who are really effectively totally locked out of the market at this stage. So there's a lot of work the government's doing. And if I can just leave you with one quick thought, you opened up by saying we hold the government accountable for affordable housing in our country. It's actually not always been the case. And our government has this really big, ambitious housing agenda. For a long time, Commonwealth governments actually haven't taken responsibility for housing. And that's one of the reasons why we're in such a fix at the moment as a country, just that history.
You mentioned there that maybe like people on lower incomes are being pushed out of the bottom quartile of housing in Australia, particularly in Sydney. I think CoreLogic released something the other day saying that there's a lot more competition in the lower three quartiles of houses. And last month, Sydney's home price actually it fell in value. But that was primarily due to the really expensive properties dropping in value because the demand's not there. Now, RBA interest rate rises have ostensibly hurt borrowing power of not just like the very cream of the crop in terms of income, but also lower incomes. What's your opinion on that? It's kind of having this strange effect, I guess you could say, where it's pushing people into maybe less or more affordable properties that would have once gone to lower incomes, but are now going to, and only higher incomes can now afford it. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think the interest rates are having massive impact on the housing market at the moment. You've spoken a little bit about buyers. It's not just that interest rates are, hurting people's borrowing capacity. It's also just introduced a level of uncertainty for people in putting together their family budget. So there'll be a lot of people listening to this who just don't feel that this is the right moment to jump into buying a house because they don't feel certain about where the economy is going. We've had some really good economic news as a country in the last couple of weeks. I'm sure you guys would have noticed that inflation fell between that band of 2% and 3% that the RBA is shooting for. And that's really good news. It doesn't relieve the kind of pain that people are feeling out there, but it does tell us that possibly things are moving in a better direction here. Just one other thing I'd just say about interest rates, though, is it hurts at the other end as well. One of the issues that we're facing in Australia at the moment is that we're not building enough housing as quickly as we need to. And a big part of that is actually interest rates. And when interest rates do come down, we should see commencements pick up at the same time, which will be a really positive thing.
And Minister, you mentioned inflation there as well. Now, I think it came in at 2.8% in the 12 months to September. Due to those energy bill subsidies. But if you look at the underlying inflation figure, it's 3.5, which is still out of that target range. And we've seen the RBA board's meeting today to decide the cash rate for November, which ties in nicely. What would you say if they had to push back their inflation timeline further? Because they've already pushed it back, I think, 6 months after the last set of economic figures were released, after their forecasts were released at the last meeting. What would your opinion be if they push that inflation timeline back further, despite headline inflation falling within target band?
Well, these are decisions for the RBA, which is an independent authority to government. So I won't make a comment on that because their independence does need to be protected. I will just say that the government's got a really important job here, and that is we need to help Australians as much as we can without adding to inflationary pressures. And that's the approach being taken. So you've seen our government deliver those 2 big budget surpluses in our first 2 years in office. That's the first time that's happened in a really long time. But we've also been able to provide cost of living support to people in ways that bring inflation down. So think about things like childcare supports, where this allows women, for example, to go out and take on more work hours, or things like the energy bill relief that you talked about there. So this is a really delicate balancing act. But I would say I think anyone looking at the economic performance of our government, 1 million jobs created, inflation more than halved, 2 budget surpluses, tax relief for every single Australian household. There's some big wins on the board here. But I say that not knowing that a lot of Australians are really doing it tough at the moment, and that's why the government's working so hard to get this right.
Claire, you mentioned tax relief. Now, there's one tax that obviously you don't control, but you have recently described it as a bad tax, and that's stamp duty. Now, obviously, that's up to the state governments, but, can't you work with the state governments like you are with the housing accords to be on the same page and somewhat work out an alternative, such as the land tax model that was proposed by the former New South Wales government?
Well, as you say, it is a matter for the states. And I was making a comment about stamp duty in the context of state governments making some changes to stamp duty that I think are really positive. We do need to see pickups in construction around the country, and the Victorian government's just flagged some relief for stamp duty for new purchases of new dwellings. So those things are really positive. We have a federation here where the Commonwealth has certain responsibilities and the states have others, and stamp duty is a state tax, and that's where it remains. But I do endorse efforts that various states have made to wind back various elements of it.
And Minister, Dom mentioned there about the housing accord. It's a very noble a policy that was launched at the start of this financial year of around 240,000 homes to be built per year for the next 5 financial years. How's that going? Is that still on track? Because I note that in the ABS building approvals data, the number of dwellings approved has lagged quite behind that goal. So how will that pick up under your government?
Yeah, so this is a 5-year target that our government has agreed to with states and territories across the country. And it is a pretty big thing that we've done there. We've set down a target because we need to be bold and ambitious, and we need to galvanise every level of government in every part of our country to really take this problem seriously. Unfortunately, housing responsibilities are shared between the Commonwealth, state and local government, and actually coordinating action around something that has that shared responsibility is complicated. So that's 1.2 million homes over 5 years. We're about 4 months into that target now, and we do need to see housing builds pick up. No one wants to see that more than me. And that's why our government is working so much with the states to try to lift them, trying to push for planning reform at a state level, bring more skills online into the construction sector, and make a range of changes effectively that will help us meet those targets. Just one thing I will say about housing is that we need to build more homes in our country, because more homes means more affordable housing for Australians. There's not a silver bullet to that problem, though. Anyone who's on the line, who's a construction expert or a builder, will be able to tell you there's a whole range of issues that need to be resolved all at once, and that's the work the Commonwealth is doing with states at the moment.
Yeah, Minister, we'll talk a bit about your friends in the opposition. They have obviously had this long-standing policy proposal to allow, well, it's a super home buyer scheme, so essentially allowing first-time buyers to access some of their super to buy a home, which you guys are against. But just the other week, we saw Brendan Coates from the Grattan Institute actually speaking of his support for allowing some early access to super, and actually suggesting savers are being asked to put away more than they need. And we've seen studies suggest that, those that retire, go into retirement owning a home, often have a much more comfortable retirement than those that don't. So perhaps, is there ever going to be any flexibility from you guys in allowing people to access their super? Because at the end, that is still their hard-earned money.
Absolutely. It's their hard-earned money, and what we don't want them to do is to do something no generation's ever done before, and that is sacrifice their lifestyle in retirement to get housing today. Every other generation of Australians has made sure the governments have worked together to make sure that they have secure, affordable housing without sacrificing their retirement savings. So let me share a few things that would happen. Super for housing is something I think most people listening, it sounds like a good idea, and then you think about it for a second and realise that if one person has access to their super, that puts them in a better position. If all young people have access to their super, then all we're doing is effectively raising house prices by the amount that they can borrow in addition to their existing borrowing power. What we would be also doing is taking that money that those young people are saving for their retirement and largely giving it to a generation of people who already have a lot of housing wealth, basically the sellers getting more money and taking that from the borrowers. What we need to do is not focus so much on ways that we can improve the borrowing power of people in the community, because the fundamental problem we have here is that we're not building enough homes quickly enough. And that's why our government is so active on this. We came to government after a decade of genuine neglect of this problem. For most of the time that the previous government was in power, they didn't even have a housing minister. That's how tapped out to it they were. We've come in with this really bold, ambitious agenda. The housing crisis isn't going to get fixed overnight because it's been 30 years in the making, but fixing it is going to require lots of diligence and lots of different efforts at different ends of this spectrum to try to make sure that we put people in a better position. But what I can tell you is we are fiercely passionate about trying to do this, because of all the issues that worry me the most about the housing crisis, it's the fact that people your age and younger are facing a radically different housing market than any other generation before you. And it's not fair. It's not fair. And we've got to work harder to make sure that you have more equality between those generations.
Now, Minister, I'll just make a comment for our listeners. The home guarantee scheme was originally a policy of the former government, and you've expanded it in 2023 to include siblings and to buy with friends as well. We're kind of jumping around a little bit here, but my last question,
just to clarify, we've made a lot of changes to the home guarantee scheme. So increase the size of that program, increase the caps, and effectively made sure that many more Australians are able to utilise that to get into housing. And that's why 130,000 people, since we've been in government, have been able to use that scheme.
Yeah, sure. My final question for you, Minister, is now I think in our chat about the Housing Accord, you mentioned working with state and even local governments to get this policy across the line. Now, one thing that hasn't really, I guess, been floated around much in media or in political circles is working with state and local governments to ease zoning restrictions and to promote more mixed-use spaces in our cities, which can be a complicated thing to do. You know, there's a lot of local governments to work with that primarily oversee this area. But is there any appetite for that at the federal level to work with local governments to ease zoning restrictions?
Yeah. So this is part of the Housing Accord. The Housing Accord requires state governments to come forward with proposals to reform their planning systems, which is the system that basically gives local government powers to make certain decisions about what gets built and where. So you've seen the different states take some different approaches to that. In New South Wales, for example, the state government has set local government specific targets and required councils to meet those targets. In Victoria, they're going down quite a significant path of looking at quite radical changes to the way zoning works around train stations. And what we know about the solution to this housing crisis is that it's going to require some greenfields development at the edges of our cities, but it is also going to require us building up in parts of our cities where we know that lots of people want to live. So that's the work that's being done at the moment. And again, just an example of the Commonwealth and the state working together in a way that's a bit unusual because housing is such a big problem for our citizens.
Yeah, Minister, we've covered a lot today, and it's really obvious from this discussion that there's no real easy solution to this crisis, but you've been very generous with your time, so we really appreciate that, and thanks so much for joining us on the Savings Tip Jar.
Great. Thanks so much, guys. Really appreciate your time.